From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
The Republican presidential nominating race has been flying under the radar these days with the war in the Middle East and various political dramas in Washington dominating headlines. But Donald Trump continues to run well ahead of the others in the field. And yet the biggest change in recent weeks has been the surge of Nikki Haley to where she is now tied or in some polls ahead of Ron DeSantis for second place in the nominating contest. What to make of the former South Carolina governor's progress, and can she build on it to emerge as Trump's main competitor? Welcome. I'm Paul Gigot, the editorial page editor of the Wall Street Journal, here with my colleagues Kim Strassel and Kyle Peterson. Welcome to you all. The latest Iowa poll, Des Moines Register poll, and it's a good poll, generally has done very well, published this weekend, found that Donald Trump is at 43% in the caucus competition, which will take place in late January, up from 42% in August, so basically flat. Ron DeSantis is at 16, down from 19. But the big news is that Nikki Haley is at 16% now, up from 6 in August in 2 months. Everybody else is in single digits. So what accounts for this Haley surge? Iowa, with its evangelical Christian base, wouldn't think to be Haley's strongest state, and yet she has gained ground. Kim, what's your analysis?
I think a couple of things are going on here, Paul. And I would note as well, too, that she's not only doing very well in Iowa, but in New Hampshire. She is now a very solid second after Trump, and the Real Clear Politics average at about 15% compared to about 10% for DeSantis and 8.5% for Chris Christie. But here's what I think is going on. First of all, she had two very strong debate performances in the first two original debates. We're going to have another one next week as well, too. But she came across as looking like the grown-up in the room, landed some pretty solid blows on competitors like Vivek Ramaswamy, DeSantis himself. I think there's that. I think a lot of people in some of these states are intrigued by her position on some cultural issues, in particular her views on abortion, which have been different from some in the pack, certainly arguing for a different approach, at least when it comes to the federal government and Congress's ways of dealing with abortion. But just in 3 weeks, we've had this major conflict with Israel break out, and her hawkish foreign policy views are making her look very much like a leader. It's providing a very big contrast with Donald Trump in particular, who has been catering a little bit more to the isolationist crowd within the Republican Party, and a Ron DeSantis who doesn't seem willing to really pick a side and who's been trying to straddle this issue. And that's given her the ability to look as though she's a real leader with a very clear vision on foreign policy.
I really want to stress myself that point about appearing to be a leader and strong. She does have foreign policy experience, apart from being a two-term governor of South Carolina. She was U.S. ambassador to the United Nations for a couple of years under Donald Trump. So she has that experience. And it's a pretty good credential to have in a moment like this. But the way that she presents herself, the firmness with which she speaks, that gives the impression of being somebody who knows what she thinks is strong convictions. And I think that has really worked to her advantage, Kyle.
I agree. I think she had a good performance in these debates. I think the debates have mattered. She's shown herself to be a good communicator and a straight shooter on some of these issues. She said Republicans have played their role in the national debt that Congress has racked up here. She has been straight, I think, on abortion, saying that all my competitors can promise they're going to pass some sort of national abortion law, but let me tell you, it is not going to get through the Senate. And then on foreign policy, taking on the new skeptical wing of the Republican Party, it turns out that the old lines of peace through strength and deterrence is still a pretty popular message in the Republican Party, despite the aid of Trump. The one thing that I would add also is just that she was a governor and then she was the U.S. ambassador to the UN. And so she had a little bit of a national profile. But I would bet that there are a lot of people in New Hampshire and Iowa who, before these debates, did not really know a whole lot about Nikki Haley.
Got to be the case.
And she comes in strong. She doesn't have a typical profile. Indian-American daughter of immigrants from South Carolina. As I said, comes across as a strong communicator and a straight shooter. And I think that people have taken notice of that. And what's really interesting in the polls to me is that she's out now number 2 or vying for number 2 in all 3 of the early states. In South Carolina, she has 19%, second to Donald Trump. In New Hampshire, she's at 15%, as Kim said, second to Donald Trump. And then in Iowa, she is still trailing Ron DeSantis, but has eclipsed Tim Scott. Fellow South Carolinian has put all his chips on Iowa. And so it's not hard to imagine if Tim Scott decided that this was not his year, as Mike Pence did. That's 9% of the vote still in the Real Clear Politics average in Iowa. And I can only think that a lot of that would migrate over to Nikki Haley.
So I think we have to break this down a little bit more here. So let's first start with DeSantis and why he has not gained more momentum in Iowa and ceding some of the vote to Haley, the non-Trump vote. And it's a little surprising given the fact that DeSantis started with so much momentum. He's invested enormous resources in Iowa, has a big organization, whereas Haley doesn't have much of one at all in Iowa. DeSantis has support from evangelicals in the state who are very strong and appreciate his abortion position, the 6-week ban in Florida. And yet he's not growing his base. And I think part of that is that what Haley has done is grabbed a lot of the vote of the so-called never-Trumpers, the people who really want to, or certainly want Trump to be defeated. Then she has done picking off more of the vote of those who are not necessarily hostile to Trump, but are open to an alternative, as well as people who are some more moderate Republican voters. There are some of those, believe it or not, Kyle, they can be spotted. Whereas DeSantis, Kim, has gone after the Trump vote with his positions. He's even run to Trump's right on some things like abortion and other things. And yet he isn't peeling those Trump voters off. So I think what's happening is Haley is getting a lot of those votes that are gettable in the Republican caucuses and primary electorate, whereas DeSantis has been trying to run straight into this Trump wall of voters, and they're not breaking away.
Right. And it makes very little sense on a couple of levels. As you note, there's a certain portion of Trump voters that would lay down on the tracks for Donald Trump, right? They're not changing their vote no matter what happens. And you can look at some of the polls that ask this question. Usually that number seems to be somewhere around 25% of the GOP electorate, maybe a little bit less, 20 to 25%. So he's not going to get those. The people who currently say in these polls that Donald Trump is their first choice, but that they are actively looking at other candidates, it's because they want to hear people who have views that are different than Donald Trump. So he's not necessarily getting those either. And that is the problem. And it's where Nikki Haley, I think, has made such inroads, especially on this Israel and overseas issue. You know, if you look at Ron DeSantis and his views, he keeps trying to somewhat be in the Trump camp, not offend this America First crowd, yet also sound like he's tough on foreign policy. And it kind of ends him up with a squishy middle. For instance, on Ukraine, he continues to repeat this line, well, you know, obviously we want Ukraine to do well, but we can't give them a blank check. And this can't be an endless war. But what does that really mean in reality? What would you do? Similarly, since Israel has come up, obviously he has voiced support for Israel, but he has spent most of his time trying to reposition this in the context of American domestic policy and spent most of his breath on this issue talking about how we shouldn't allow refugees from Gaza to resettle in the United States. He would cancel the student visas of Hamas sympathizers. These are certainly policies that are worth discussing, but they're not the central issue at stake here at the moment in this Israeli conflict. And I think Haley's clarity on this is why you are getting such a big distinction between the two and why she's doing better pulling in those voters.
Yeah, and DeSantis is clearly worried about Haley. How can you tell? Well, he's attacking her and attacking her in advertising. Let's listen to an ad that the DeSantis allies have been running against her in early states, and then a response from the Haley campaign.
This Chinese company, run by Communist Party officials, supplies materials for the Red Army. America's Army trains over half of all new soldiers at a South Carolina base. The connection? Governor Nikki Haley helped the Chinese company set up shop 5 miles from our base. On land she gave them, where they fly China's flag, serve China's interests.
Ron DeSantis can't stop lying about Nikki Haley. DeSantis gave millions to Chinese companies. DeSantis even voted to fast-track Obama's Chinese trade deals. Ron DeSantis, he's lying because he's losing.
All right, Kyle. So there's an uplifting exchange here for American politics, and yet has nothing to do with Ukraine, nothing to do with, as Kim said, the major issues. This is about China, which, of course, is becoming a big issue in American politics. And each of them claiming the other is soft on China. Even got in there a little red China, I think, if I heard it.
Yeah, and the reality is I think they would both be probably pretty tough on China. I don't think either of them is soft on China. I haven't gone through those ads to fact check and try to make sense of what they are even claiming. But I would second what Kim said a moment ago about Ron DeSantis, because I think part of the problem he's having is trying to have a foot in each camp. Just to expand on one of the quotes he said, this was, I believe, at the last Republican debate. He was talking about Ukraine. He said, "We are not going to have a blank check. We will not have U.S. troops. And we're going to make the Europeans do what they need to do." And so I'm not sure who he's fighting against that is arguing for putting U.S. troops in Ukraine. I don't think that's a position that anybody is taking.
Nobody's saying that.
And the same with some of his economic policies. He had a big economic rollout recently. One of the things in it was bringing U.S. capital back from China using, quote, strategic tax abatements, which looks like the kind of industrial policy that is popular on the Trump right, but to my eye is not something that would work and is also not consistent with Ron DeSantis' previous record in Congress and not consistent with what he has done as the governor of Florida, where what has made Florida such an economic success story is low taxes, no income tax, light regulation. I would much prefer, and I think he might have more success with the kind of voters that are supporting Nikki Haley, if he would say that's what I would do as president.